Why So Cold contains content that is graphic in nature. Listener discretion is advised. Why So Cold relies largely on police or news documents, eyewitness accounts, press conferences, and interviews. Every episode of Why So Cold is produced with respect to the victims, families, and communities involved.
From Watts Creative Studios, this is Why So Cold. In 1996, two young women and their dog set out on a hiking trip in the beautiful Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. But when they didn't return home at the agreed time, a worried family member contacted the park rangers, who soon discovered the couple's bodies at a tranquil campsite. Straight away, it was clear the two had not died to a freak accident or wild animal attack, but in the hands of another human being. Since then, several suspects have emerged over the years, but to this day, nobody has been convicted of the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans.
Day and the visitors are coming in droves to enjoy the scenery and hike the backwoods trails of the Shenandoah National Park. The same trails that 24-year-old Julianne Williams and 26-year-old Lolly Winans had come here to travel. They were last seen alive on May 24th. Their bodies were found 8 days later. Rangers are still posted at the path leading up to the crime scene, but there are other rangers out there walking the Appalachian Trail, talking to hikers about what they might have seen these last few weeks. Investigators are following many leads. Forensic evidence, though, is the backbone of such cases. Flags mark where possible clues have been found. Logbooks like this one have been taken out of the shelters where the women may have stopped. Park police are reviewing any parking or speeding tickets written in the past few weeks. And while officials say this is an isolated incident, hikers now aren't taking any chances.
Laura Lolly Winans and Julianne Julie Williams, both in their 20s, met in 1994 at a nonprofit organization focusing on education and adventure travel for women in Minnesota, called Woods Women. The two came from very different backgrounds, but their love for the outdoors bound them together, first as friends and later as lovers. Lolly was born into a wealthy family in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. But according to those close to her, she rejected the privilege and grew up to be a down-to-earth person. After graduating from high school, Lolly attended college in Vermont for a while, but quickly dropped out. Within the next few years, she got engaged to a man, worked at various jobs, and took in a teenage sex offender under the aegis of a state agency. That arrangement forced Lolly to address her own past and her traumas caused by the abuse that she went through as a child. As a result, Lolly decided to begin therapy and quickly realized she needed to do something else with her life. And so, Lolly moved across the country and continued her study at Unity College near Waterville, Maine, with a dream of becoming a wilderness guide. That dream eventually led her to an internship at Woods Women and the same tent with Julie Williams. Born in St. Cloud, Minnesota, Julie was a high achiever from the start. Growing up, she volunteered at a women's shelter, performed community service work in Columbia, won the Minnesota State Doubles Tennis Championship before finishing high school, and later traveled to Europe to study paleontology in college. Julie worked with migrants and people suffering from abuse, spoke fluent Spanish, and eventually landed a job at Walden Books in Burlington, Vermont. And yet, Julie sometimes had doubts about where her life was headed. Not just because she was not sure what she wanted to do with her life, but also because she was questioning her sexuality. Julie had dated men throughout college, but the feeling of something not being right persisted. Lolly and Julie began their relationship cautiously. After all, being with a woman was something new for both of them. However, soon enough, the two realized that they were both happier than they'd ever been and started to make plans for the future together. As the summer of 1996 approached, Lolly and Julie looked forward to living together. They had found a house in Huntington, Vermont, and as Julie had also secured a new job in Lake Champlain. It was time to celebrate. For the couple who love the outdoors, going for a hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia was a perfect way to do so. Before leaving, Julie told her friend Zoe that she now believed that dreams come true and that her life was exactly where she wanted it to be. Julie also promised that she and Lolly would return in time for Zoe's wedding on June 1st. But unfortunately, that was not to happen. On May 19th, Julie and Lolly began their trip in Shenandoah National Park with their golden retriever Taj, stopping at Pinnacle's Overlook on Skyline Drive. Based on the photos discovered from the couple's camera, they then set out along the White Oak Canyon Trail, passing great boulders, 400-year-old hemlocks, and 6 separate waterfalls. The weather was rainy for the next 2 days, but we know Julie and Lolly rode with a park ranger to renew their camping permit before they set out again. Next, they climbed the park's highest peak, Hawksbill, which offers fantastic views of the Virginia mountains, including Naked Top, Bushy Top, Stony Man, Crescent Rock, and Old Rag. Later that night, they set up a camp in a peaceful spot a half a mile off Skyline Drive near the Appalachian Trail. Even though both women were experienced hikers and campers and nothing serious had ever happened to them on their trips, Julie's father, Thomas Williams, immediately began to worry when he did not hear from his daughter on their supposed return date on May 28th. As the radio silence continued for the next couple of days, Thomas did not have any other choice than to report Julie and Lolly, who to his knowledge was only a friend, missing. That same day, on May 31st, park rangers at the Shenandoah started searching for the couple and quickly located their car just north of Skyland Lodge. Deputy Chief Park Ranger said they continued the search along the trails in that general area and eventually came across Taj, the golden retriever, who was wandering through the park unleashed without Lolly and Julie. The next day, on Saturday, June 1st, 1996, the bodies of both women were found at their campsite near Skyland Resort on Bridle Trail. Lolly was inside the tent, gagged, her hands bound with duct tape, and her ankles with a pair of long thermal underwear. She was partially undressed, but there were no signs of sexual assault. Julie was found in her sleeping bag, about 40 feet away from the tent. She had been bound and gagged with duct tape, and like Lolly, she was also partially undressed, but not raped. Both women had died in the same way. Their throats were deeply cut. It's believed that the murders took place 24 to 30 hours before the bodies were discovered.
What essentially happened was 2 young women hiking in the Shenandoah were randomly targeted, identified, and murdered while camping on the trail. It was a horrific crime, a particularly grisly crime, case that was enormously emotional for our region and frankly for my agents and for this office. The folks that are assigned to it now were assigned to it decades ago. It's very unlikely that the person had, the killer had identified these 2 victims and then just stopped their career of crime.
When a crime happens in a national park, the investigation is not the most straightforward process. Shenandoah is an exclusive federal jurisdiction, meaning only the federal government has law enforcement authority there. In this case, the National Park Service handled the investigation with the FBI in addition to the Virginia State Police Crime Scene Unit. Of course, a multi-jurisdictional investigation like this one is not necessarily a bad thing, but can make things a bit more complicated. In addition, locating, accessing, collecting, and preserving evidence outdoors is always challenging, especially when we're talking about an area that 1.57 million people visited in 1996 alone. Because of that same reason, it is quite easy for a murder to slip through the park gates unnoticed. Still, no matter where a crime takes place, one of the first questions is always the same. What was the motive? As it seemed that none of Julie and Lolly's personal belongings were missing, robbery was quickly ruled out. At the same time, sexual assault remained a possibility, even though there was no evidence to prove it. However, as soon as the news broke out that Julie and Lolly were lovers, it didn't leave just the family shocked, but the LGBT community too. Soon after, the Vermont Coalition for Lesbian and Gay Rights recognized the killings as a hate crime. In fact, the FBI found some similarities between the Shenandoah National Park murders and a decade-old Eastern Virginia case involving two lesbians. Back in 1986, Rebecca Dowski and Kathleen Thomas were found dead in a car near Williamsburg. Their throats were slashed, their wrists had been bound, and there was no sign of struggle or sexual assault. And as their purses were left inside the vehicle, robbery was ruled out as a motive. Nobody can deny that there are a striking number of similarities, but the FBI has never found forensic evidence to prove that the two cases are linked. Without any promising leads to follow, not much progress was made for over a year after the discovery of Julie and Lolly's bodies. But then, a suspect emerged. On July 9, 1997, a Canadian tourist, Yvonne Malbasha, was cycling south on Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park, admiring the Blue Ridge views. Suddenly, a man driving a truck forced her to stop and tried to pull her into the vehicle while screaming sexual profanities. Fortunately, Yvonne was able to fight him off and hide behind a tree as the man got back behind the wheel and tried to run her over several times. The man eventually gave up and drove away, but park rangers caught him as he was trying to leave the national park. When they searched his car, rangers discovered hand and leg restraints. The attacker was identified as Daryl David Rice. He was in his late 20s and living alone in Columbia, Maryland, without previous criminal records. However, Daryl had just been fired from his job at Maryland's MCI System House because of his behavior. According to his coworker, Daryl had, among other things, yelled at them, punched a hole in the wall in the bathroom, and stole lunches. In 1998, Daryl David Rice pled guilty to the attempted abduction and was sentenced to 135 months in a Petersburg, Virginia federal prison. Soon after, the authorities began to think Daryl might have had something to do with Julie and Lolly's murders. In addition to the fact that he had tried to attack another woman in the same area, surveillance footage also showed Daryl entering Shenandoah around the time of the murders at 8:05 p.m. on May 25th and again at 4:57 p.m. on May 26th. He returned with his friends Carol and Robert Ruckert on June 1st. The last time Julie and Lolly were seen alive was May 24th, so the timeline matched perfectly. Daryl David Rice was eventually charged with the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans on April 10, 2001. According to the prosecutors, Daryl had made questionable comments, including that the two women deserved to die because they were lesbian whores, and that he enjoyed assaulting women because they were, in his words, more vulnerable. In addition to the murder charges, Daryl was also charged with a hate crime, which meant he could receive the death penalty if convicted. But that never happened. Even though the prosecutors had used years to build the case against Daryl Rice, in the end, it was not enough. They lacked physical evidence that would have linked Daryl to the murders. Actually, the evidence they had eventually made the whole case fall apart. In 2003, a hair found from the crime scene was analyzed, and the DNA test results showed it did not match the victims. But it did not match Daryl either. And so, as they had just proven someone else had been in the crime scene, charges against Daryl David Rice were dismissed without prejudice, meaning he could still be charged again if new evidence was found. Daryl has also faced suspicion in the death of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, whose remains were found outside Lignum the same month Julie and Lolly were killed. Apparently, witnesses had seen Alicia speaking with an unknown person on Route 29, the southbound shoulder of the highway. The suspect reportedly drove a dark Nissan pickup truck and was a white male in his 30s or 40s with medium-length brown hair and appeared no taller than 6 feet. The same person, dubbed Route 29 Stalker, allegedly flagged down several women driving alone, trying to get them to pull over, and then claimed their car had been sparking, so they would exit the vehicle. Daryl Rice indeed fit the description of the suspect in the case, and he drove a similar truck to the one described by the witnesses. But again, there's not been any other evidence to prove his involvement. Daryl has since been released from prison for the first time in 2007, but he served an additional 9 months in 2009 for a probation violation, and more time in 2010 after violating the conditions of his release again. In 2014, police publicly asked people to stop spreading rumors about Daryl David Rice, as he had served his time and there's nothing more they can do. However, many still believe that he had a hand in the double murder. Curiously, the FBI has failed to rule out known serial killer Richard Mark Ivanitz, who killed 3 young girls in 1996 and 1997 in the Fredericksburg area, as a suspect in Julie and Lolly's case. As Richard committed suicide in 2002 because police were closing in on him after another girl he had abducted escaped and alerted authorities. There is no way of questioning him, but his DNA could still be tested against the sample from the Shenandoah murder scene. Apparently, Richard had told his sister right before his death that he had killed more people than he could remember. That doesn't sound like he was responsible just for the 3 murders we know about. It is also worth mentioning that Alicia Showalter Reynolds' parents also believe Richard is more likely the one responsible for the murders than Daryl David Rice. Nevertheless, for one reason or another, the FBI has never really seen Richard Ivanitz as a potential suspect in the National Park murders, even though Daryl Rice's lawyers first pointed to him as a real killer almost 20 years ago. Since then, a lot of time has passed without new breaks in the case, but Julie and Lolly have not been forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, I worked here at the time, and obviously I still, Lolly Winans to Julianne Williams, and it was heartbreaking then, and I do still think of them, and I know the other folks that worked with me at that time. I am sure they can conjure up, they can not just conjure their names, but the idea that 2 young women, and in the case of Miss Showalter too. I mean, young women whose lives were cut short far too soon. Yeah, they were in a very special. It's a place that's special to us.
It's very unlikely that the person had, the killer had identified these 2 victims and then just stopped their career of crime. So we are looking actively to do what we can to link this case to other cases. We are using new technologies to exploit the physical evidence in the case. No one has been exonerated in this case. And so our aperture is wide open. We are looking at anyone that had any relationship to the events on the Shenandoah 20 years ago that took the lives of these 2 ladies.
As of now, the families of the 2 women are still waiting for answers to why their lives were cut short over 25 years ago. The FBI has stated that the investigation of the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans is still open and active, and for that reason, They're not releasing information about any potential suspects at this time. However, they have said they will need the public's help to finally solve the case. This has been an episode of Why So Cold. For the source material used in this episode, visit whysocold.com.